I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our Creator and our Redeemer. Amen. So I'm getting tired of Skittles. Yes, that's right, Skittles. Those yummy little multicolored bites of sugary goodness. Now, sure, they may seem innocent and fun. Don't let that fool you. Skittles are trouble. And lately, they have been causing some issues in my world. Now, it started innocently enough. You see, my kid's tennis coach, he uses Skittles when he is coaching them to reward them for doing certain things well. So if they listen, they get a Skittle. Good shot. Skittle. Say something nice. Skittle. Win a game. Skittle, right? And the kids, they count them up during practice, and then when it's over, they get the allotted amount of Skittles after it's done. Now, I'm not actually sure if they are doing tennis because they like tennis or because maybe they just like Skittles, probably. And then the kids count them up, and they get them, and these Skittles have begun to cause a few problems, you see. See, the kids don't always get the same amount each week, and so as these Skittle amounts have grown, mixed in with Skittles that they have bought or got from other places, well, now they are constantly counting and keeping track of how many Skittles they have. And not just that. Sometimes they'll trade the Skittles, right? 2 yellows for a red seems to be very popular these days. And then sometimes they'll lend Skittles to each other and sometimes borrow some Skittles, which I'm not honestly sure how you borrow Skittles because I'm sure you wouldn't want it back in any way, shape, or form after you've borrowed it. And so now not only are they trying to constantly keep track of how many Skittles they have, but also how many Skittles they all owe each other, right? It's all very, very complicated. And all of this came to a head this past week when one kid got upset with another because, Lord help me, using a calculator, they figured out that one of their siblings owed them 16 Skittles, and they wanted payment pronto, right then. But it was a debt, of course, that the other kid said, I could never pay that in a million years, probably because they ate all the Skittles that they were supposed to pay back. Now, it's funny to laugh about kids being obsessed with counting Skittles, but in some ways it's a reminder for us of how we as people, both young to old, have this desire in us to count, to keep track, to compile, to keep score. And we do that in pretty much every aspect of our lives. And that could be Skittles, could be money, could be favors, or even slights we feel against us. We are counters by nature. It's a control thing, really. And we do it so much that it pervades every aspect of our lives, including, I think, pieces of our faith lives. And particularly when it comes to the way we view and think about forgiveness. Now, a few weeks ago, I preached a sermon on forgiveness where it turns out I stole much of my thunder from this week. And in that sermon, I talked about how forgiveness is one of the most difficult things that we as Christians are called to do. And so like Peter, in our gospel story today, we can't help but try and force forgiveness into some parameters to make it all a bit more manageable. I mean, it's fine and all that Jesus asks us to forgive, and we get that, we're okay with that. But we also want to put some number limits on it so that forgiveness, and we can keep track of it and how much we're doing it, because that's what any reasonable person would do, right? I mean, it would be ridiculous to think that we can just constantly and endlessly forgive, and my guess is that's what Peter was thinking as well. Now, last week, in our gospel text, Jesus was talking to his community about what it looked like to live as God's people with each other, and how there are times when issues come up, and those issues, they need to be called out into the light so that they can be dealt with. And so this week, as the story continues, the next piece of that is, well, okay, when those wrongs have been brought out into the light, Peter wants to know how many times we are called to forgive that person. And he has a guess, I mean, he's feeling pretty generous that day too. So he says, well, Jesus, how about 7 times? And that may not seem like a lot, but actually that was going pretty big. You see, the rabbis taught that they were to forgive 3 times. That was the custom, and then the punishment would happen if the sin was a 4th time. I guess something like a very early version of 3 strikes and you're out. So Peter was taking that 3 and he was doubling it, and then he was adding 1 more time just to really take it to the next level. And probably to earn some Bible bonus points with Jesus, because he knew that 7 was the perfect number and the number associated with God. Now, surely 7 times would be more than enough, right? I mean, that would, yeah. And we kind of nod our heads in agreement with that. Well, if Peter was trying to play the numbers game, he was obviously doing it with the wrong person. So you want to play the numbers game, Jesus says. Okay, Peter, how about this? How about you have to forgive not just 7 times, but depending on how it's translated, 70 times 7. Now, for you math wizards out there, that doesn't mean 490 is the magic number and we should get our own calculators and start figuring out how much we have until we reach that forgiveness quota, and then we can just call it quits and we're done. Because in the Bible, the way that's actually translated is that it's an unquantifiable amount, meaning it's an endless amount. In other words, forgiveness, Jesus says, must go on forever, and it never ends. So what Jesus is saying to Peter, and those of us who are so anxious to keep track and to get some parameters and numbers solidified around this forgiveness thing, is that all of this, it isn't about the math. And Jesus isn't trying to get Peter to increase his forgiveness quota, per se. It's that he wants Peter to stop counting altogether. Because forgiveness, it's like love. It's inherently relational and not legal, and therefore it can't be counted. And what Jesus is saying is that forgiveness isn't just one more thing on our Christian checklist, to do or not to do. All right, forgiveness. I want to check that off. Forgiveness isn't just what we do, it's actually who we should be. Forgiveness, it's not just a part of our life. It's actually a way of life. And that's why we can't count it, and that's why we can't keep track of it. It's just who we are, created in the image of a loving and forgiving God. So the question for us then is, how do we move from where we so often find ourselves? And that place is when we're hurt and alienated, and we're angry, we're feeling vengeful, and we're adamant about keeping track of what has been done to us, and we're struggling to forgive. How do we get from that place over there? How do we move from there to over here, to where we're called to live? In that place of boundless and endless forgiveness, living a life that is reflective of who we were meant and created to be. Because, let's be honest, that's a difficult move to make, isn't it? It is for us. It is for Peter, and really it is for anyone who follows Jesus. And Jesus knows that. And so to help us make that move from there to there, he tells us today a very powerful story about a king and a servant. Now in the parable, the king is owed 10,000 talents by a servant. That sounds like a lot, right? Well, it's not a lot. It's an impossibly enormous, astronomically absurd amount. It's way beyond a lot. You see, a single talent, just one, was the equivalent of about 130 pounds of silver, and so it would be about 15 years worth of wages in first century Palestine. So the amount that the servant owes to the king is the equivalent of about 150,000 years worth of income. I mean, the people hearing this story would have literally laughed out loud at such an outrageous amount, because they knew that there was literally no way possible, not in 1,000,000 years, that servant would have been able to pay back that amount. And so the only thing the servant can do, the only option he has, is to beg for mercy. And unbelievably, the king gives it to him and forgives this monumental debt. But then this same servant leaves, and he comes across a fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii, and he demands that he pays him what he owes. Now, a denarius, by comparison, was worth about a day's wage, which means that the one servant owed the other about 100 days of labor. Now, that's no small debt, but still, nothing even close by comparison to what that servant had owed the king. And anyone who hears this parable then and here this morning comes to the same conclusion, right? We think, well, how could he not forgive this relatively minor debt when he had just been forgiven this absolutely huge one? How could someone be that clueless, that messed up, that they would actually walk out of the king's palace on that road paved with freedom and grace and then act with such cruelty to a fellow servant who was also in debt? And then suddenly it starts to sink in for us, the same way it did for those listening to Jesus' story, and we think, well, wait a second, that's exactly what we do in our lives. I remember years ago when I first read the story and studied it, I actually struggled with it a lot because I would wonder, how would it ever be possible to forgive the way that the king forgives? And thought maybe that was the point. How could we ever hope to be able to forgive so endlessly and abundantly like that? It was almost discouraging in some ways. But then over time, it occurred to me that actually we don't have to do that, because that's not really what Jesus is asking us to do. I don't have to identify with the king in this story because that level of forgiveness is beyond my human capabilities. But you see, I can identify with the servant who had this massive debt forgiven, who was given a clean slate, who was allowed to walk away free and clear, because that's exactly what's happened to me and to you and to everyone. When Jesus died on that cross with our sins and our debts attached, and was raised 3 days later without them. Which means that the most important thing that we can learn from all of this isn't to assume or insist that we must go out and forgive all these enormous debts, but maybe it's simply there for us to bask in the unbelievable forgiveness and acceptance and grace that we have experienced. And then try as much as we can to live that grace and mercy and forgiveness out in our normal day-to-day lives. Really the failure of the first servant isn't just his lack of forgiveness for his fellow servant. Don't get me wrong, that was bad. But when you think about it, the real tragedy of this story is that this servant had just experienced an utterly unexpected, completely beyond his wildest dreams, life-changing moment of grace, and he seems absolutely untouched by it. And because of that, he lives devoid of any sense of gratitude in his life. Think about it. His whole world, his whole life was changed, and he didn't even notice or give it a second thought. His heart and his mind were so closed that he didn't even allow this experience to change the way he lived or to change the way he treated other people. How tragically sad is that? I saw an ad recently that Chrysler Hall in Norfolk would be hosting the musical Les Mis in January sometime. And I was reminded of a time a few years ago when the movie version came out, had Hugh Jackman and Anne Hathaway and people like that. And I was talking about it with someone at the time who had recently seen it, and they thought it was great, right? So great, in fact, they said, they should really make a musical about that movie, all right? Because that would be awesome. It would be, and well, it is, since I'm sure you know it's one of the longest running musicals on Broadway. And I vividly remember seeing it in New York when I was 12 years old and just being blown away by it. But one thing I will say about the movie version, bad singing aside, is that what really struck me in the movie was the moment that the main character, Jean Valjean, who is played by Hugh Jackman, the moment he has with the bishop in there. Now, 17 years after being released from prison for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his sister's starving children, Valjean, he's desperate and homeless since no one will help a convicted felon. Finally, one night, he's taken in by a kind old village bishop who trusts him and feeds him. He gives him a place to sleep and cares for him, since everybody knows that all priests are suckers, right? But in the night, Valjean, he can't help himself, and he steals the bishop's silverware and his plates. And he's caught trying to escape, and the police, they return and bring him back to the bishop, but instead of accusing him of theft and having him thrown back into prison, the bishop instead, he shows him mercy, and he forgives him for what he's done. He tells the police officer that, well, no, the silver, it was a gift. Even saying to Valjean, well, you forgot to take the most expensive, precious moments, the silver candlesticks. Take those with you as well. And the officers had to free him. And the bishop only says to Valjean that he must take this silver and this moment of forgiveness and grace, he must let it change his life for good. Now, to say that this rocks Valjean's world would be a massive understatement. I mean, you can see powerfully on his face how much he struggles to even comprehend this incredible gift that the bishop gives him. You could see the disbelief in his eyes. How could he be, this wonders? Why would he do such a thing for a man who didn't deserve it? How could he possibly be so gracious and merciful to a poor, miserable wreck like me? And then eventually you see something else, relief, and then peace. And it would be that moment of forgiveness and mercy that would change his life and how he would go on to live it. I mean, the rest of the story of Les Mis, if you know it, is devoted to how Valjean cares for a young girl and loves and looks out for those who are around him because he knows what God, through that bishop, had done for him. Valjean allowed the bishop's mercy and forgiveness to shape him and to change him. The servant who experienced it from the king, he didn't. So the question is, having experienced this same gift, what will we do? Will we sink into this mercy and grace, sink into it so much that we allow it to change the way we see the world and the way we live? Will we give the same grace and mercy to the people that we encounter each and every day in our lives, whether we think that they deserve it or not? Will forgiveness become, not something we're just checking off some Christian to-do list, but will it be a part of the very core of who we are and how we live our life? Or will we continue to count Skittles and keep track? Will we seek to put limits on something that was never designed to be limited? Hope and pray for all of us that will be the former, not the latter. I know we're not going to always get it right, and forgiveness, it's really hard, and it can be complicated, and we're really imperfect people, but even when we don't get it right, guess what? We'll have new chances to try again. How many, you ask? Well, funny that you should ask that. 70 times 7, Jesus says. In other words, endless. So there's no need to count. Amen.